On this channel, we provide useful programming information with practical code examples. This time, we're going to talk about CSS properties related to grid layouts. You can learn how to describe grid and inline grid. This article also includes practical content such as how to lay out headers, sidebars, and footers, so be sure to read until the end. Enabling subtitles will make the code descriptions easier to understand. First, let's take a look at grid. A grid is a layout system for aligning elements in two-dimensional rows and columns. Using a grid, you can easily and flexibly construct complex layouts that were difficult with traditional float or position methods. While Flexbox excels at one-dimensional layouts, the grid is suitable for two-dimensional layouts. The GridBox class applies a grid layout by specifying grid in the display property. This element is called a grid container. The grid template columns property specifies the width of grid columns. In this example, the first column is 100px, the second column is 200px, and the third column takes up the remaining space, auto. The grid template rows property specifies the height of grid rows. The first row is 100px, the second row is automatic, auto, and the third row is 50px high. The gap property sets the spacing between grid items, adding 10px of space between columns and rows. A grid container is an element with the display property set to grid, and its children become grid items. Grid items are the child elements placed directly under a grid container. The grid template columns and grid template rows properties define the size of each column and row. Units like px and %, as well as fr, fraction, to specify a proportion of the remaining space, can be used. In this example, there are 3 columns, and the second column is twice the width of the others. Grid column and grid row are properties used to specify the position of grid items. Instead of cell numbers, the numbering is based on grid lines. In this example, the item is placed from the second to the fourth vertical grid line and from the first to the third horizontal grid line. In other words, it occupies the cells in columns 2 and 3, and rows 1 and 2. Grid lines refer to the lines that divide rows and columns within a grid container. Grid lines are automatically numbered starting from 1 and are used as boundaries for rows and columns. For example, a grid with 4 columns has 5 vertical grid lines numbered from 1 to 5, and each cell is placed in the area between these lines. Grid auto rows and grid auto columns are properties that control the size of rows and columns that are automatically generated when grid layout lines or columns are not explicitly defined. In this example, 2 rows and 2 columns are explicitly defined, but if more elements are added, new rows or columns will be auto-generated according to grid auto rows and grid auto columns. Align grid items horizontally, justify items, and vertically, align items. Grid area is a property that allows you to specify the row and column ranges at once to position a grid item. You specify the position using the grid line numbers, not the cell numbers. In this example, the item is placed from the first to the third horizontal grid line, and from the second to the fourth vertical grid line. In other words, it occupies the range of cells in rows 1 and 2, and columns 2 and 3. Gap adds space between columns and rows. You can also specify the spacing between columns and rows individually using column gap and row gap. Grid auto-flow is a property that sets the direction in which items are placed, either by row or by column. Let's look at examples of complex layouts using grid. In this way, grid allows you to create an entire web page layout with simple code. In this example, there are 3 columns, sidebar, main content, and advertisement, and 3 rows, header, content, and footer. The header and footer occupy the full width of the page, with the content in the center, and the sidebar and advertisement on both sides. The advantages of grid include the following points. Easy 2-dimensional layout. Managing the layout in both rows and columns allows even complex layouts to be achieved with less code. Compatible with responsive design. The grid system makes it easy to create responsive designs that adapt to different screen sizes. Next, let's take a look at the gap property. The gap property is used in grid layouts and flexbox layouts to set the spacing, gaps, between elements. Using this property, you can easily place space between child elements. In the gap grid container class, a gap of 30 px vertically and 10 px horizontally is set between each element. Since a 3-column grid is created with grid template columns, gaps are applied vertically and horizontally between each element. In the gap flex container class, a gap of 50 px is applied between the 3 items in the flexbox. The row gap specifies the gap between rows. This is the vertical spacing in grid or flex layouts. The column gap specifies the gap between columns. This is the horizontal spacing. If 2 values are not specified, one value is applied to both row gap and column gap. The benefits of the gap property include the following. Simple gap setting. The code to set gaps between child elements becomes simpler, eliminating the need to set extra margins or padding between elements. Flexible adaptation. It easily supports responsive design, allowing flexible design adjustments. Next, let's take a look at the grid template areas property. The grid template areas property provides a way to name areas within a grid container and use those names to easily position grid elements. Using this property allows for visually intuitive layout definitions. Elements positioned in named areas specified by the grid template areas property should have the same name assigned with the grid area property. Even if elements span multiple cells, they are automatically positioned correctly. In this example, the grid is created as follows. In the first row, header is placed across 2 columns. Sidebar is placed on the left and content on the right in the second row. Footer is placed across 2 columns in the third row. In the grid template areas property, the name of the area is specified for each row. By placing elements into regions with assigned names, you can easily create layouts. In this example, a grid with 2 rows and 3 columns is created, and each cell is named Area 1, Area 2, etc. If you want to have empty cells in your layout, you can represent empty cells using a dot. As in this example, by specifying a dot between sidebar and content, the second column becomes blank. The advantages of the grid template areas property include the following points. Visual layout. It allows you to visually express the layout, making it easier to understand the design. Easy element movement. You can easily adjust the element layout by changing the area definitions in CSS without modifying the HTML. When using the grid template areas property, it is important to pay attention to the following points. The number of names in each row must match the number of defined columns. If you assign the same name to multiple cells, those cells will be merged. If you assign the same name across different rows and columns, the area must form a rectangle. Next, let's look at inline grid. Inline grid is one of the values for the display property in CSS. Applying this property makes the element behave as an inline level container, creating a grid formatting context internally. Unlike display grid, it behaves as an inline element in the document flow. Inline grid is not as common as grid, but it can be effectively used in specific scenarios. Grid within inline context. Useful when you want to place a grid alongside text content or other inline elements. For example, it is helpful when a grid structure is needed for buttons, badges, labels, etc., but you want to display inline without disrupting the text flow. Layout control within inline elements. Even when complex layouts are needed within inline elements like links, buttons, or spans, inline grid can manage the internal structure with a grid layout while avoiding block display. In this case, the button displays icons and text in a grid, while remaining inline in the document flow. Responsive inline components. Inline grid can be used for small components that are part of inline content and require a grid layout. For example, it is suitable for inline forms, badges, product labels, etc., where you want to adjust the layout with a grid while keeping it inline. Like other inline elements, inline grid respects vertical alignment relative to surrounding content. You can control the alignment of the grid using the vertical align property. Regarding size, an inline grid element occupies only the width required by its grid content. If necessary, you can explicitly set the width, height, and maximum dimensions. It is also possible for the layout of the grid itself to determine the size of the inline grid container, and this tendency is stronger when using flexible units such as FR, auto, and percentages. The source code for this video can be downloaded from the official website. If you like, please visit the URL in the description to aid your learning. See you in the next video. Please subscribe and give us a thumbs up.